Okay, so welcome to our presentation. Our paper was looking at the public debt and governance relationship with a specific focus in sub-Saharan African countries. So this is the content or the outline of our presentation. We will have a brief background. We look at why the issue of public debt deserves attention, specifically now. We look at the objectives of the study, how we developed our hypothesis, the methodology, the results, the conclusion, and possible policy recommendations. So in the recent past, we've seen an upsurge in public debt, especially with regards to sub-Saharan African countries. Statistics have shown us that we've had an increase in public debt. And when you're looking at the increasing level of public debt, we're actually looking at public debt as a percentage of GDP. So it has ballooned to nearly 60% of GDP over the past decade. And this has been largely driven by the fact that it has been increasing annually at an average of between 10 to 25 percentage points since 2012. The basic question then becomes, what is really driving this upsurge in public debt? We know for a fact that public debt is caused to a great extent by economic factors, for instance, fiscal and external balance, and has been elaborated in most sub-Saharan African countries whereby we have low commodity prices, low value addition, and low productivity. We've also had instances where governance has been pinpointed as a key factor to what is driving the current levels in public debt accumulation. And a specific focus has been directed on the issues related to lack of transparency and accountability, especially when it comes to public debt management. The recent factors that have also contributed to a great extent to the conversations around public debt is the current COVID-19 pandemic and the possible implications that it would have with regards to the current debt levels, both for sub-Saharan African countries and other economies. So the COVID-19 pandemic has led governments to think of ways of increasing their borrowing and even call for other avenues, for instance, debt relief, with the intention of cushioning their citizens from the harsh economic shock. However, we've had an outcry by citizens on the legitimacy of expanding the sovereign debt borrowing and initiatives by the government to call for debt relief in order to build back the economies better post the COVID-19 pandemic. In their view, they think that the issue related to public debt is a governance issue, and initiatives, for instance, calling for debt relief and other things, in as much as they might help in the short run with regards to cautioning the citizens against the harsh economic times, they might not be the viable solution, especially when you're looking at how the trend has been with regards to public debt accumulation within sub-Saharan African countries. So far, the outcry by the citizens has been based on anecdotal evidence. So we don't have empirical analysis per se that speaks into this and gives us evidence to say this is how then governance affects public debt when it comes to sub-Saharan African countries. So one of the aims of this research paper was to legitimize this claim using empirical evidence that we gathered from sub-Saharan African countries and a comprehensive definition of governance, which borrows precisely from Kaufman et al., who defines governance using 6 indicators, collectively known as the worldwide governance indicators. So then we ask ourselves, why is it that we feel that the issue of governance and public debt deserves attention? And in order to answer this, we'll go back a little and look at what history has shown us so far. So we know for a fact that the current debt crisis is not a new experience, especially for sub-Saharan African countries. We've had initiatives that have sought to address this. For instance, in response to a similar debt crisis in the 90s and early 2000, the Paris Club, through the International Monetary Fund, deployed the heavily indebted poor countries initiative. So through this initiative, it allowed for debt cancellation for a majority of sub-Saharan African countries. For instance, debt was cancelled for 31 sub-Saharan African countries. So following the debt cancellation or the debt relief, we witnessed a high growth rate averaging at about 6% of GDP on account of increasing commodity prices, which drove long-run economic growth. But when we look forward to what has happened 10 years after debt cancellation, we're still back to where we were, despite the fact that some of these countries in sub-Saharan Africa were given the debt relief initiative. So then we ask ourselves, how did we get here? And what really happened between the time that the debt relief was given and what is currently happening? So in 2014, for instance, we had a fall in commodity prices, which profoundly affected economies in sub-Saharan Africa. We had a reduction in export revenues, which ultimately led to budget deficits. And then, as we know, the government expenditure is sticky downwards. Anytime that government has an opportunity to expand its expenditure, it will always do so. But in terms of economic downturn, the government is not always willing to adjust its expenditure downwards. So what then happens is that the government becomes outward looking and it looks for avenues to borrow in order to augment its current level of expenditure. So we had an instance where most sub-Saharan African countries that are considered resource rich opted to borrow against the expected future rise in commodity prices. So this further aggravated the current situation that we are having when it comes to public debt in sub-Saharan African countries. And then another fact that has also played a key role has been volatility in commodity prices, which ultimately leads to debt repayment being harder, meaning most countries end up borrowing either to pay the debts that they have or just not being in a position to service the debts that they currently have. Another thing that's really coming out is the role that governance is also playing when it comes to accumulation of public debt. So literature that has been done in different jurisdictions actually speak to the fact that the beneficial effects of public debt on economic growth can only be achieved when...
That's the correction.
Sorry? Can I continue with the presentation?
Yes, please. You can go ahead. We were just trying to get the Portuguese interpreter onto the call. Yeah.
Oh, there is an interpreter. So does that mean that I need to go slowly or something? Okay, so literature has shown that governance plays a key role when it comes to public debt accumulation, and that for the effect of public debt to be positive in terms of supporting economic growth, this has got to be tied to a macroeconomic framework that's pegged on good governance. And governance, to a great extent, determines the level of public debt as well as the distribution of public debt with regards to how the debt is used, how the debt is managed, in which projects the debt is directed to, which ultimately play a pivotal role when it comes to aspects, for instance, economic growth. So having that background, then these are the specific objectives of our study. So the overall objective was to examine the relationship between public debt and governance for sub-Saharan African countries with the aim of enhancing evidence-based policy discourse on governance as well as public debt. Specifically, we seek to create awareness and elevate priority given to governance in explaining public debt issues on the African continent and beyond, and leverage on the extent of JENA and other networks in deploying widespread advocacy for good governance, especially as it relates to debt and well-being. Another objective of the whole process was to produce research outputs, for instance, toolkits, which enhance the technical capacity and advocacy interventions of people within the sector and within the country. So our research was guided by two main hypotheses. And the first hypothesis is guided by literature that directly speaks to how governance affects institutions and how then that leads to public debt accumulation. So from the literature that is evident, we are told that bad governance produces systemic inefficiencies that strongly limit the government's ability to articulate a sound fiscal policy. So based on that, our first hypothesis is that public debt accumulation in sub-Saharan Africa is associated with poor governance. And then we also went a notch higher and recognized the fact that countries in sub-Saharan Africa are not heterogeneous, especially when it comes to natural resources. We have countries that are considered resource rich, and we also have other countries that are not considered resource rich. So for a country to be considered resource rich, we went according to the definition of the International Monetary Fund, which actually looks at the composition of the exports that a country is making and looks at how much of that export is directly related to the resources that the country has. So the benchmark has been if a country is exporting more than 25% of its resources, it gets its revenue from exporting more than 25% of its resources, then it can be considered a resource-rich countries. And when you're talking about the resources, we're looking at resources that are non-renewable, for instance, oil, for instance, copper, things like that. So for such countries, we expect them to be more inclined with regards to how public debt and governance affects them, because we know what has been literature has shown between the relationship of resource-rich countries and how their governance systems and their governance structures are. So specifically, we noticed that 80% of government expenditure for resource-rich countries is directly driven or directly tied to their export revenue for the natural resources that they have. So this then means that government revenues for resource-rich countries rise and fall in tandem with the international commodity prices. So this is a very dangerous scenario, considering that we have earlier on said in the previous slides that government expenditure tends to be sticky downwards. So it then means that for instances where the expenditure supersedes the revenue, then the government becomes more outward looking. So it tends to borrow from international markets in order to smoothen the expenditure pattern and just make sure that they're at similar consumption level. So this phenomenon has been explained to a great extent by two authors, Acemoglu and Robinson, who actually directly ties this to what he calls good economics but bad politics. And data has to an extent validated this phenomena, because we get to notice that the Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index and World Bank's Country Policy and Institutional Assessment constantly ranks resource-rich countries in terms with low levels when it comes to aspects like corruption and governance. So they are constantly ranked low in comparison to other countries within sub-Saharan Africa who are not considered resource-rich. So based on this second stream of thought, we come up with a second hypothesis that guides our study, which simply says, for resource-rich countries, public debt is lower with better governance. So in order to assess this hypothesis, we delve a notch deeper into the whole concept of governance using the framework that has been outlined by Kaufman et al., and deviating a little from the previous strand of literature that has entirely focused on corruption in its attempt to explain how governance affects public debt. So specifically, we use the concept that is outlined by Kaufman, and we define governance as the traditions and institutions by which authority is exercised. The authors go a notch higher, and they derive three key areas that governance should look at when you're looking at it in totality. So one, we look at the process by which governments are selected, monitored, and replaced, the capacity of governments to effectively formulate and implement sound policies, and the respect of citizens and the state for the institutions that govern economic and social interactions among them. So under each aspect or under each key area, we then have two indicators that are derived under it. For instance, under the process by which governments are selected, monitored, and replaced, we have voice and accountability, which looks at the extent to which citizens in a country are able to participate in choosing their governments, the freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and a free media. We also have political stability and absence of violence, which shows the likelihood that the government will be destabilized by unconstitutional or violent means. When we look at the area under capacity of governments to effectively formulate and implement sound policies, we look at government effectiveness and we look at regulatory quality. Regulatory quality measures the adoption of less distortionary and market-friendly policies in areas of trade as well as business. Under the respect of citizens and state for institutions that govern them, we have rule of law, which reflects how well economic agents adhere to society, rules of the society. And then we also have control of corruption, which looks at the extent to which public offices are used for private interest, as well as the capture of the state by the elites. I would want to speak more into this slide and just bring to your attention the fact that out of these 6 governance indicators, a majority of research work has been done with a focus on corruption. So some of these governance indicators are not adequately talked about, or they're not adequately highlighted in literature. So one of the value addition that this research paper is going to have is that one, we're looking at all the governance indicators in totality, and then we're also doing this study with a specific focus on sub-Saharan African countries, because we know the unique characteristics of countries that are associated with sub-Saharan African. And we're also doing a distinction and trying to see whether the impact of governance on public debt has a difference when we look at sub-Saharan Africa countries in total, and then when we also make a distinction between the resource-rich sub-Saharan African countries. Another thing that I'd love to bring to your attention is the fact that, yes, there are research that have been done using this methodology, but the downside has been the research have focused on other jurisdictions, for instance, the MENA region. And to this end, they're not able to give us evidence that's directly related or tied to the sub-Saharan African context. So this research paper is going to give us that. And this to a great extent is going to see or is going to inform our advocacy initiative when it comes to matters governance and public debt. So when you're measuring these governance indicators, they basically range from negative 2.5 to 2.5, with higher values denoting better levels of governance. So yeah, that's what we intended to do. So now we looked at the descriptives of what's currently happening with regards to the governance indicators in sub-Saharan Africa. And the chart that I am presenting shows the performance of the 6 governance indicators between the period of our analysis, that is from 2006 to 2019. What I would love to bring to your attention with this slide is the fact that political stability and absence of violence was the best performing governance indicators for periods between 2006 to 2013. And some plausible explanation to that would be it was due to improvement in key dimensions such as demographics and development, and also the concerted efforts through massive investment in conflict prevention and peacekeeping. Another reason why that indicator might have performed very well during that duration would be it's the duration that also directly links to the initiative, the HIPIC initiative. So maybe countries at this point in time were very concerted in order to ensure that their political stability and absence of violence is a notch higher for them to receive this debt relief. So that might also explain to a great extent why that indicator performed very well, especially during those seasons. And then as we move from 2014 going to the recent years, we have a drastic decline in public stability and absence of violence, and then a continuous downward trend in subsequent periods. So what then explains this? And maybe it might be on account of what's happening in some of the sub-Saharan African countries with regards to upsurge in large-scale organized crime, as well as small-scale armed conflicts in countries such as Nigeria, Somalia, to mention but a few. We can also see that voice and accountability has been the second best performing governance indicator, closely following political stability and absence of violence. But then there has been a downward trend since 2006. And apparently this indicator has been having an upward trend since 2014. It has been recovering during that period. So we have seen consistent improvement in subsequent periods for it to become the best performing indicator. One thing that I would like to bring to your attention is the fact that control for corruption over the years has had a consistent and inconsistent trend, whereby it's improving in some periods and coming down in some periods, and even worsening in others. So it's been one indicator that's not very consistent in terms of whether it's having an upward trend or a downward trend. And when it comes to the worst performing indicators, we have government effectiveness, we have rule of law, and we have regulatory quality. So this speaks the sub-Saharan African countries' story. That's where we are not doing very well when it comes to the governance indicators. So now we've looked at how governance has been performing with regards to the 6 indicators over a period of time. We also look at the trend that public debt has exhibited over the years and just try to bring the two in one graph and see whether there's any directional change, anything that we can infer from it before we actually delve into an empirical analysis and see how the two variables are actually interacting and what the data is actually telling us. So in general, we can see that public debt as a percentage of GDP reduced by 7 percentage points from 54% in 2006 to about 47% in 2007. And we know that this is driven by various factors, and economic factors also play a key role in it. Having that information in the background, we also look at how public debt has been performing or governance has been performing in a similar period, and really try to ask ourselves, is there a mirror image, or is there something that's really also driving this public debt when we put aside the other economic factors that we know also have an effect on public debt. So what we're actually seeing there, the graph on top is the graph that's showing us the trend with regards to public debt. And then the ones we have down there, the bars are actually showing us the performance of the world governance indicators. And in a nutshell, this gives us an indication of the two variables, how they are moving together. And it affirms the notion that governance plays a pivotal role when it comes to public debt levels. So in general, we can see that in periods when political stability and absence of violence is the best performing governance indicator, public debt actually exhibits a downward trend. And in instances where voice and accountability is the best performing governance indicator, public debt exhibits an downward trend. Actually exhibits an upward trend. Yeah, if you look at it from 2014, it goes up. Yeah, and a similar trend is observed. So having that in mind, the main objective of our research paper was to provide empirical evidence. And this can only be done when we look at the data and do an estimation, so that even as we're talking about how the governance indicators actually affect public debt, we have figures, empirical figures that we can tie to the whole estimation. So this then brings us to the aspect of which methodology then did we use for the whole analysis. So we were looking at 48 countries in totality for sub-Saharan African countries. And our time period is 2006 to 2019. Our choice of time period was majorly guided by data availability. So in instances, there were some certain instances where we couldn't get data up to the latest, that is 2021. So we opted to use a strongly balanced panel data for the 48 sub-Saharan African countries for a period of 2006 to 2019. And then we did our estimation using a fixed effects model. And this was guided by the tests that we did that actually showed that using this particular data set, it was the most ideal for our estimation. So that then presents the equation that we actually estimated. So we are looking at public debt as a function of various variables. And in these variables, we have the 6 worldwide governance indicators, and we control for other variables that we know for a fact that have an influence on public debt, so that we then isolate the individual effects that the world governance indicators have on public debt accumulation. So basically, that is the regression equation that we looked at in our analysis. So after doing our estimations, this is what we found out. So I'm going to speak into two things. We're going to look at the science of the worldwide governance indicators, and that will tell us what then happens if we improve the worldwide governance indicator by 1 unit. So the first equation that I'm presenting shows us what happens for the 48 sub-Saharan African countries for the period 2006 to 2019. So we have a negative sign for 5 of the 6 governance indicators. What that basically means is that an improvement in the governance indicator by 1 unit leads to a reduction in public debt levels by the coefficient that we have there. So if we start with control for corruption, we then say, if efforts are made by civil society or those concerned in order to ensure that we reduce the level of corruption in a country by 1 unit, then the resultant effect that we would have on public debt would be that public debt at that point in time will reduce by 0.644%. And this is consistent with what previous literature show, because corruption increases fiscal deficit by redirecting government expenditure from productive ventures to other ventures that are rent-seeking, but they don't have a productive effect to the economy. So this in turn decreases the government revenue and ultimately making governments look for other avenues in order to expand their expenditure. So that explains that relationship. A similar thing is observed for political stability and absence of violence. It also has a negative sign. Government effectiveness also has a negative sign, and all the other indicators. The only indicator that has a positive sign is voice and accountability. And a possible explanation to why voice and accountability tends to have a positive sign, meaning when the indicator improves by 1 unit, then public debt levels in sub-Saharan African countries increase by 0.078%. So then we ask ourselves, why is this indicator behaving like this? And one strand of literature actually speaks to the fact that voice and accountability shows to a great extent how the lenders perceive a country. So if a country is performing well in terms of its voice and accountability, then maybe to an extent, lenders consider them less risky borrowers. So in that case, if the country then does not have the right framework to ensure that it does not overborrow, then we might have it having multiple loans from different sources, which when cumulatively put together actually leads to an upsurge in their debt levels. Yeah, so that's what's coming out. And then for the other control variables, we look at their signs, because we are controlling for them and actually acknowledging the fact that they might have an impact on public debt levels, but we are focusing purely on the 6 governance indicators. And what the analysis is purely telling us is, yes, they are negatively correlated with public debt. And yeah, if we improve on them, then we have better chances of reducing our public debt levels. So this affirms our first hypothesis that good governance actually leads to a reduction in public debt levels. We went a notch higher and separated the African countries into 2, cognizant of the fact that we have resource-rich countries and the phenomena that Asimoglu talked about, the aspect of good economics and bad politics. So such countries may be predisposed to aspects of poor governance, and would really want to see whether there's a significant difference in impact on how the governance indicators interrelate with public debt. And from the estimation equation, we actually see that for every governance indicator, the coefficient is higher for resource-rich countries as compared to countries that are not, as compared to looking at sub-Saharan African countries in totality. What then does this say? It ultimately means that countries that are resource-rich need to really pay keen emphasis when it comes to improving their governance, because things like control for corruption, you can see for a fact here that it has the coefficient of 0.727. This is like 0.1 percentage points higher than the coefficient that the sub-Saharan African countries in totality presented. So yes, we can say that the effect of governance on public debt, especially for resource-rich countries, is higher in comparison to other countries that are not considered resource-rich. So then concerted effort needs to be done to ensure that everything is put in place so that this effect is minimized for the resource-rich countries. So that then brings us to the conclusion of the whole paper. So in a nutshell, we can say that the results that we have seen from the empirical analysis support our hypothesis that good governance leads to a reduction in public debt. And then from our analysis, we also found out that the governance indicators are highly correlated and they complement one another as they influence public debt. So if we want to improve on governance, then we cannot just focus on one aspect, let's say corruption, and neglect all the other governance indicators, because in a way, when you're looking at corruption, it has a way that it also affects public stability and absence of violence, regulatory quality, rule of law, and other indicators. So then focus should be made so that we improve them together as a block. So yeah, governance indicators need to be improved alongside one another for the effect of public debt to be felt in totality in an economy. And we also look at the fact that we have found out that the effect of good governance in reducing public debt is higher, especially for resource-rich countries. So for them, they need to have a lot of concerted efforts, both by the governments and the civil societies and the private sector, to ensure that governance actually improves in all aspects if they want to tap into the positive effects of public debt, especially on economic growth. So then that brings us to our policy recommendation. And one of the things that really needs to be done, especially with regards to the civil society space, is that they need to play an active role in spearheading initiatives that seek to improve governance in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's on the basis of, we need to let citizens know what really entails. As we're talking about governance, what does it mean? What are the indicators to look at? How then can citizens play an active role in order to ensure that they hold their governments accountable with regards to how they manage public debt? Another thing is particular attention needs to be directed to initiatives that limit corruption, especially in resource-rich countries, without forgetting other countries in sub-Saharan African revenue, because public debt is driven to a great extent by the revenues that the government gets and how these revenues are how do you say, they are leaked out of the economy. So if you can find a way to ensure that all the revenue that a country generates are actually used for the intended purposes, then we won't need governments to be outward looking or to go and borrow. Another way would be, even the money that is borrowed, we will ensure that it's used for activities that are not trend seeking, activities that ultimately lead to an improvement in the economic well-being, which then makes debt repayment to be less painful, especially when we see the effects, the positive effects that it has on the economy. So another thing would be the civil society should play an active role, especially when it comes to advocating for the need for resource-rich countries to join the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, because this initiative has guidelines that serve to reinforce governance for member countries. And this would help them a great deal, especially when it comes to them improving their governance structures. And we have seen how the improvement in governance will ultimately lead to a reduction in their public debt level. Another thing that's actually coming out is attention needs to be given when it comes to aspects, for instance, policy formulation, in order to ensure that some of the policies don't have a counterproductive effect on the economy.
Father Charlie, you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. I said, she covered the paper very well. Just to boast 3 points that I feel are quite important for Africa, where I feel civil society could pay more attention. The first one is a point that she ended with, to ensure that, because as you saw, the second component of the governance variables, the 3 components, focuses on the capacity of government to formulate policy, implement it, and follow it through. And one of the difficulties we have there is, especially when she spoke to resource-rich countries, where countries tend to introduce tax holidays and incentives to attract foreign direct investment, because governments in Africa are sort of at a loss when it comes to extraction. We don't have the technology, except maybe for South Africa, but most countries don't have the technology and capital to extract minerals. So we tend to look for capital from outside and FDI in general from outside. So what we do is to put in incentives and tax holidays to attract these business people. But what literature has shown in the last 10 years that is counterproductive. The cost benefit shows that we lose. So that's something that we really need to focus on as civil society, and question that and see if we can come up with policies that are really effective. They sound good in theory, but actually they tend to eat away at Africa's revenue. The second point, I'm talking to revenue issues here, because the difficulty that African countries face usually is a problem of what they get and what they want to spend. There's a huge disparity. The fiscal deficit is huge. So to help them is what I've spoken to, but also from our work, from our research, we found evidence of very large shadow economies in African countries. beyond informality, but also shadow economies as a result of corruption in places. And that it's a good percentage of revenue. So yes, if all these 6 indicators are taken into consideration, corruption and everything that promotes a shadow economy will likely be stemmed, okay? But it's just important also for society to pay attention to that, you know, how help government to understand how that shadow economy grows, because the illicit flows of money, both within countries, okay, and outside countries is huge. And 80% of that has been found to come from the natural resource sector. So that's something to pay attention to. Just in terms of, like at the moment, Sabina spoke also to the poor, sometimes the lack of optimality when allocating resources by governments. You see, they have 5 years or 4 years to perform. So if they put in any economic decision, for us to see results, it may take 10 years. But the politicians want votes. So what they do, what you have seen in Nairobi, in Lusaka, in Ghana, Accra, everywhere, Lagos, you see these big roads, big stadia. You've seen them. Those of you who may have gone to these cities in the last 4 or 5 years to show people that. But actually, as Sabina explained, those are sources of leakages, because there's a promise of inflating prices. There's a promise of bribery, but also a promise of getting votes. You will recall that when we were getting HIPIC, there were conditions that were put in place strictly to ask African countries to take a certain amount of money to allocate it to health, to education, and to social protection. And there was quite some stringent measures there, okay? And that sort of disappeared along the way. And we have seen, something that she didn't touch on, we have seen a reduction in allocation to education, to health, and to social protection. And the money has been taken to those things that can be shown. So what we could do is, how can we bring back those frameworks within countries, civil society within countries, to push for those frameworks that will support control and ensure that there are structures, okay, of governance that ensure that the allocation of resources is optimal and that is followed through. And that will certainly lead to thinking about the future, but also growing not only economies, but also developing people, developing capital, as well as paying attention to human rights, access to health, access to education, and things like that. So it will take long, just under 1 minute. And at this point, most African countries are broke. What Natasha, Sabina was talking to, put differently, was African countries tend to borrow because of problems of revenue, okay? And at the moment, they don't have the income. So we may want also to help African countries during this very difficult patch to get more quick aid so that they could use it at the moment to cushion the impacts of COVID-19. While it's true that they can make amends that will see changes in the next 3-4 years, at the moment, what they may need support in is the liquidity. Maybe we could pay attention to that, and soft liquidity rather than the easy money that comes from somewhere. Yeah. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much for that reaction, Father Charlie. You know, as Sabina has told us, all the 6 governance indicators are very important and need to be, working well for it to have an effect of reducing public debt. So our next contributor will be very well placed to especially talk about, the regulatory quality as well as government effectiveness, because he has worked in the government institution. So our next speaker is Dr. Leonard Nkole Kalinda, who is an advocate of the High Court of Zambia and a chartered arbitrator and a certified anti-money laundering specialist. So he has extensive experience working for the Bank of Zambia since 2001, where he became the chief legal advisor. He also served as the chairperson of the SADC Committee of Central Bank Governors Legal Committee for 6 years. He is now a partner at Equitas Legal Practitioners. So Dr. Kalinde, please give us your remarks and your reaction to the findings of the paper.
Thank you very much, Ms. Muchindu. Indeed, let me join Father Chilufya in commending Sabina for that excellent presentation. Indeed, the paper has raised very important issues that should help us to inform policy. I was particularly touched by the points the paper brought out regarding how the debt relief that African countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, got during the HIPIC initiative, we squandered the opportunities that was presented to us by that debt relief. And we have gone back to pre-HIPIC levels of debt, if not more. And the question that Sabina asked is very critical. What happened? What has led to this? So I see myself that in addition to the points that Sabina raised as what could have caused that, indeed the issue of governance is critical. The issue of the fall in the prices of commodities also plays a role in there, and therefore reduce earnings from export and all, but also the aspect of governance, in particular, the lack of a public debt management framework, or the legal framework for public debt management, which imposes discipline, accountability, and transparency, I think has greatly contributed to the situation where we are at right now, in that the citizenry, for the large extent, were not informed why these huge borrowings were made on their behalf by their government from external lenders and all, and indeed to what use was this money put to. So there is this disconnect between, indeed the genuine need for government to raise finances in order to, attend to their responsibility of providing services to the public, but also how these finances are utilized, why the debts are being incurred in the first place. So this lack of proper governance tools, in particular, in my view, I would state the lack of transparency and accountability and discipline, in the sense of being able to impose sanctions if need be on those who be found to be misusing public resources or indeed involved in corruption, has been also a key factor in leading to the current state of debt that sub-Saharan Africa is currently facing. And I was particularly interested in how the other indicator for governance, the VAV, I think she called it voice and accountability. I was not clear on the correlation between that indicator and the debt levels in sub-Saharan Africa. And the explanation that we got from Sabina was that it could be that perhaps international lenders were encouraged by, the freedoms of expression, perhaps in a country, by citizens and civil society, and that could have led to that. But I was also thinking, could it also be possible that perhaps with increased articulation of people's grievances to their government, and indeed civil society's lobbying for the government, there was pressure on the government to increase its expenditure profile, in the sense of attending to the socio-economic needs of the public, where now high demand was placed on the government to provide certain services in a manner which was not properly planned or timed for. I was just wondering whether that could also have been a contributor, that with increased freedoms from the public to voice their concerns and their grievances to the government. The government now is under pressure to respond to those demands by going out of its way to raise funds to attend to those needs. It's something that I would want maybe Sabina to just comment on. Otherwise, I'm grateful, Natasha, for the paper presented by Sabina. It's quite informative, and I commend the Jesuits for the work in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kalinde, for that contribution, and also the point that you have made about government wanting to spend more in order to respond to the voice that is coming from the people when we see an increase in voice and action and accountability. So Sabina, I'll allow you to quickly respond to that before we bring in the next reaction from Fernando. Thank you.
Natasha, I lost network coverage at some point. I would kindly request him to come up with the question again if he doesn't mind.
Okay. Okay, let me just explain what he was saying, Sabina. He was saying that in addition to your explanation on, because we saw that a positive VAA leads to an increase in debt. And you said one of the plausible explanation would be that it gives a good, if the people who are lending to a country feel that there's accountability and voice in the country, then they'll be able to, give the country or lend more to that particular country. The contribution from Dr. Kalinde was that in addition to that, it's also possible that, or plausible, that because of high voice, action, and accountability from the citizens, they will probably be demanding more from the government. And because they are demanding that the government does more for them, that will lead to the government contracting more debt because of the voice that is coming from the people. So he just wanted you to comment on that.
That's a very interesting way of looking at it. And I think it might try and explain why that indicator has been having a positive association with public debt accumulation. So it would then mean that the citizens are pushing the government to give them results without actually considering what the government has got to do in order to ensure that those results are actually delivered. So yeah, maybe we could look at explaining that in line with what Dr. has brought out. Thank you.
Just a very quick one, Natasha, very quick, without taking too much time. And I think what Sabina mentioned also that some of these variables that we are looking at, including the one that Dr. Kalinde has introduced, they are self-reinforcing, they are correlated. Because where we found an increase in debt, especially it was mainly in countries where, like countries that had a high voice accountability, places like Kenya, Zambia, Ghana, we associated them with the Eurobond. That's why we came up with that conclusion. But it could also be true, for example, that where they are stuck, for example, they don't have revenue when there's a call for more allocation to education or to roads or to whatever.
Health, for example, in Zambia, the health sector.
Yeah, they would have more leverage to go and borrow than a country that doesn't have voice and accountability. If they go to Europe to borrow, for example, for commercial lenders, they'll be listened to more. But I agree, there could be other pressures like the one that Dr. Linga has mentioned. I just wanted to put a point that they are self-reinforcing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mutually reinforcing. So mutually reinforcing.
Thank you. So we're going to move on to our second contributor, who is Fernando Saldivar. He is the Global Policy and Advocacy Officer for JENA in Nairobi, Kenya. He is a member of the USA West Province of the Society of Jesus. He is also a visiting scholar in the Department of Philosophy at Loyola University, Chicago. Prior to entering the USA West Province of the Society of Jesus in 2016, Fernando was in private practice as an attorney and has been a member of the State Bar of California since 2005. So great to have you, Fernando, and please go ahead and give us your reaction from the findings of the paper.
Thank you, Natasha. And let me just say again, thank you for letting me join all of you this afternoon and participating on this, this very esteemed panel discussing an issue which is of critical importance, not only to sub-Saharan African countries, but really to the entire global South, because the issues here that we're discussing, while they have a particular resonance here, are by no means limited to these countries. But I think our response to it, our critical response to it, can help to shape policy and reflection on a global level. So it really is an honor to be here today. And I want to begin with perhaps a rather bold premise, but one that actually needs to, I think, shape our entire discussion, both of the paper itself and of the topic of public debt. And that is, for sub-Saharan African countries, debt is unavoidable. Fiscal conditions are such that governments here cannot meet their operating costs simply through revenue collection. The money has to come from somewhere. It has to come from somewhere in order to cover the fiscal deficit. And that needs to shape our discussion, because all of the talk that we've had, or that that is going on both at this conference and in the background, about a need for debt forgiveness or for debt relief, and the critical need for either of these, does not change this underlying fact that debt is unavoidable. And that the problem of outstanding debt, the debt that's already been contracted, the debt that's already burdening SSA states, it exists at the very same time as the current need to contract additional debt in order to fund government. And that's to say nothing about additional capital that's needed to fund investments in the future, that's needed to fund infrastructure. All these needs too, the manner in which that will need to be covered is going to need to come from debt. Therefore, if the need for African sovereigns, for states to contract debt remains current, if that's in fact true, and I believe that it is, then we need to look at issues of how that debt is contracted and who has the authority to bind the public, who has the authority to contract on behalf of the state. And as Dr. Kalinde mentioned, what we're looking at when we discuss that are questions of transparency in the debt contraction process. To dive a little bit deeper into some of the background on which the paper is developed, the economics literature, which is built upon the 2010 Kaufman paper, where the worldwide governance indicators are laid out, and which form the basis on which the paper that we're discussing is built upon. All of that establishes a framework for looking at debt and governance econometrically, using statistics and mathematics to look at correlations in the data. That's perfectly fine, and that's a powerful tool. And there's a time and a place for that kind of analysis. But what I want to interject, what I want to offer, is that there's something missing from the discussion of debt and governance if we only focus on the statistics, if we only do an econometric analysis. And that, I believe, is the question of how these rules actually function in the real world. And where that brings us to then is to the legal and institutional dimension of governance as it relates to debt. And I think this particular set of questions, this area, it provides a critical space for the legal profession in each one of these affected countries, for political scientists, and for civil society at large to collaborate on a discernment of the contours of this nexus between debt and governance by focusing on and reflecting on the rules themselves, on the laws, the statutes, the regulations that underlie debt contraction, and the structures that exist in each one of these states for enforcing compliance, and those same structures that exist for adjudicating disputes. Because as you know, is laid out in the literature and in our common knowledge, there are going to be disputes at every level of debt contraction and every aspect of resolution. And how that gets hammered out factors into this analysis of governance, because those structures are deeply, deeply embedded in this whole framework of what we call governance. So the question that may arise is, why does this matter? Why does it matter to look at the laws, the regulations, the structures? It's because I believe an examination of law and institutions should be a key part of public debt management analysis, PDM, which Dr. Kalinde mentioned. And to a great extent, this examination is not currently being given the importance that I believe that it merits. And I want to examine this from the angle of public debt management, PDM, because our goal ultimately is not to reinvent the wheel, but is to show how the tools that we already have can be improved, how they can better be used to analyze these social realities. And I believe that this is a way in which we can improve PDM, public debt management analysis. And just as a little bit of background, according to the IMF, PDM, public debt management, are the strategies employed by a country's national authority to manage external debt. And the IMF in particular uses this as a metric to ensure that a government's financing needs and its payment obligations are met at what they define as the lowest possible cost over the medium to long run, which is consistent in their view with a prudent degree of risk. Now, there's something wrong with that definition, at least from what we're discussing here. And that part that's wrong, if you will, is that it's tremendously one-sided. It's focused on the creditor and the creditor's interest, the IMF's interest. It asks the questions of, who are we dealing with? Do you have a plan for paying us back? And it's not all that different from what a commercial bank does when it looks at you or your business, when it looks at individual creditworthiness, when it asks, do you have a job? Do you have assets? Are you able to pay us back? And that's tremendously focused on the creditor. But what I suggest is that in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, there needs to be a governance aspect to PDM, the public debt management. And specifically, it needs to ask questions related to how decisions are made about contracting public debt. In particular, something that will examine the role of the executive, the role of the legislature, and ask the question, is there overlapping authority between the executive, for example, the president or the finance ministry, and the legislature in regards to who has the authority to contract debt? Do they both have it? Is it undefined? Are there certain areas where the executive can contract debt and certain areas where the legislature has authority? Is this well defined? Is this in the Constitution, or does this exist in some other form of organic law? Does the public have access to these materials? Is it something that's readily available to the public to legal scholars, or is this something that's buried in materials that are hard to access? Questions related to who can raise the debt ceiling? Is that something that's reserved to the executive, or does the legislature have the authority to do that? And this is another point too, something that Dr. Kalinde raised. For what purposes can new debt be contracted? Why are we borrowing? Who has a say in that, and who has the authority to decide? From whom can we borrow? And this is important. Are there requirements that states seek concessional loans from the Paris Club nations before they go to China? Is there some kind of rule or regulation defining whether or not debt can be contracted from private creditors, when debt can be contracted from the bond markets in the North, particularly in the US or in Europe? Are there rules and structures for spelling all of this out? And the issue of China that I just raised raises an interesting issue that fits into all of this. It raises the issue of transparency. What are the rules for publicizing the contractual terms of debt? Where are disputes adjudicated when there's a dispute particularly with private lenders or with other states? Are there rules mandating that be adjudicated in foreign courts, or under what law, or in a private arbitration forum? All of these are questions that need to be spelled out, and the question of whether or not that information is available is key. And all of this goes towards one common goal. And again, this is a point that Dr. Kalinde raised, that we want to and need to examine governance issues related to debt. And we want to look at those through three particular keys. They are transparency, oversight, and accountability. And each of these three, these are questions of law and institutions. They're important, they're critical questions, but they're questions that so far have been missing from this larger discussion of debt and governance. And in a way, it's a warning, if you will, that while we're doing sophisticated and very deep econometric analysis, that we need to recognize that these questions and this analysis done from a legal framework, from a political science framework, it's a missing but a key corollary, an adjunct to this economic analysis. And it's a reminder that to really dig deep, to really make an attempt to address the issue, the problems related to public debt, the problems related to governance, our approach needs to be multidimensional. It needs to be multidisciplinary, and that there's a space, if you will, for those of us coming from different backgrounds, particularly those that aren't coming from the strictly finance world or the economics world, to make a contribution. And I think this is a reminder that this is one of those areas where the legal profession, where those who are doing research and analysis in government and in structures can really make a contribution. So again, it's been a tremendous honor to be here today, and I look forward to discussing this further. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando, for that very insightful reaction. And I think the key things we need to focus on, as well as the econometric analysis, is laws, regulations, structures. And I think you've also mentioned that we need to look at public debt management analysis in totality. So I'll bring back Dr. Kalinde, because I think, so we're talking to two lawyers here. But Dr. Kalinde has worked for, the Bank of Zambia, and we know that currently Zambia, I think, is and correct me if I'm wrong, is the only country that has defaulted on its paying back its national debt to its international lenders, of course, as a result of the challenges coming from COVID-19. We've also seen that Zambia's debt has increased very much over the past, I think, 7 years. We're now standing at almost 12 billion US dollars. And I'm made to understand that Zambia does have a legal framework of debt contraction. And Dr. Kalinda, you can talk more about that. We're supposed to go through the legislature. I think there's a framework of how debt is supposed to be approved. So maybe I can ask this question. What institutional framework do you recommend, for sound debt contraction and management? And I think you can give some examples, some specific examples from Zambia, because I do know that we do have, I think, a framework, but we still find ourselves in a position where we have so much debt to the point where we have actually defaulted.
Thank you very much, Natasha. Indeed, the situation in Zambia with regards to our debt contraction has been something of great concern to not only the citizens, but also to many of our investment and business partners as a country. I think before I respond to your question, it's very important that we are clear that for most developing countries, maybe even developed countries to some extent, financial resources are always in short supply. And Fernando has done a good job to explain that. So financial resources are always in short supply. Meanwhile, the government is required to provide public services and goods. So it is normal that as a country operates as a budgetary deficit unit, the government will need to borrow from surplus units to fill their respective budgetary deficits, especially where domestic revenue is inadequate. I just want to make that point clear from the onset. So borrowing is normal. In fact, you'll find support for that even from the treatise that was issued by John Maynard Keynes in 1935, who actually supported the government's need to borrow, in order to bridge this financing gap in the event that domestic resources are inadequate. However, Keynes says that the debt should add value, to the economic prosperity of a country. That is, this should be debt that will contribute to capital formation and which will lead to economic growth. So this is where the challenge is. So the opening statement I'd like to make is that it's normal that government will need to borrow because of this deficit, that they have in their financing. And also the deficit could be as a result of a timing issue. Maybe the rate at which they're able to accumulate taxes is not quick enough to meet the financing needs that they need to do. So the challenge that we have, Natasha, is that how can we have a sound public debt policy and debt management practices, that will support a sustainable debt accumulation framework. And I'd like to submit to you that this requires a robust legal framework, a sound public debt policy and debt management practices. They need to be anchored by a robust legal framework. And I'm going to demonstrate that. But before that, I want to submit, Natasha, that I don't know how much time do I have on that question, Natasha, before I get lost with my responses. Sorry?
You have about 3 more minutes. 3?
3 more minutes. Okay, so I'll move very quickly. Yeah, very unfair question. So, sound public debt management, it's important that you have a process where you establish and execute a strategy for managing the government's debt, in order to raise the required amount required for funding at the lowest possible cost over the medium to long run. So what you find that in this robust legal framework, I'm going to be very quick. The law is central to supporting that PDM, okay? While political and economic factors tend to influence debt policies and the quality of debt management practices, a good legal framework helps to promote discipline, like I said earlier, transparency and accountability, all of which are critical to achieving a sustainable debt. So in this regard, the public debt management must be guided by broad parameters set out in the law. Okay, and these include, Natasha, clearly stipulated objectives of public debt management, a debt management strategy, and annual borrowing plans. So the institutional framework that needs to be designed for that. And I'm going to rush through this because of limited time. First and foremost, it's important that the law clearly states out the role of the legislature. What is the role of the legislature, Parliament, in terms of approval of the broad framework and oversight? So in Zambia, for instance, Natasha, you asked me to comment on the Zambian law. We have a constitution which is very clear in terms of Article 63 of the constitution. It gives Parliament the responsibility to approve public debt before it's contracted. That's what the constitution provides. But then we have now supporting legislation, which is known as the Loans and Guarantees Act, where you find that the minister is able to contract this debt without seeking approval from Parliament. So there is a mismatch between the operating law, which is the Loans and Guarantees Act, and the Constitution. So these two need to be harmonized. And the Constitution is supreme. It overrides an act of Parliament. So we need to do work in that area. So moving on, the executive also has got a role, Natasha. At the level of an executive arm of government, institutional arrangements for debt management are also key. The legal framework, Natasha, should provide explicitly for debt managers' powers to be exercised solely by the Minister of Finance on behalf of government. The challenge that we saw in Zambia is that other ministers were able to contract debt without the Minister of Finance knowing. And it came as a shock because in terms of the legal framework, it's very clear that the Minister of Finance is the only one who's got responsibility to contract debt on behalf of the nation. But for some reason, the laws were ignored. You see, there's a distinction between constitutionalism and the Constitution. I wish I had more time to explain the two. But constitutionalism is the culture, the discipline to follow the laws as laid down by your legal framework. So the Minister of Finance should have the sole responsibility of contracting debt on behalf of the nation. And also there's an oversight role of cabinet in debt management. I'm rushing, Natasha, because of time. But most importantly, there is...
No, it's okay. I'll give you 2 more minutes. You're talking about very important things.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yeah. So, Natasha, also the need to create a centralized debt management office. This is very important. Centralization of all debt functions need to be in a single unit or agency in order to reduce fragmentation and in order to enhance coordination in a debt management. Because if there's no coordination, for instance, you may find that you're going to have gridlocks. You will not be able to know the entire portfolio of debt that's sitting in a country. So consolidating debt management functions helps government to maintain a holistic view on all of its debt obligations, thereby promoting effective risk management of the overall debt portfolio, debt servicing, audit, Natasha, and evaluation and reporting. This is very important. And maybe let me just end by these two. These other 2 points, 3 points rather. There is need for a committee between the central bank and the Minister of Finance. And if there's a Minister of National Planning, you need to have a committee of these officials so that they can coordinate and monitor debt. There is also need to have advisors, agents, advisors, and dealers. These debt managers, you'll find that in some countries, they will outsource certain debt management services to agents and advisors. These agents, Natasha, could provide services to support the issuance, registration, and settlement of government securities. So these institutional frameworks need to be put in place. You'll find that in Zambia, the central bank plays the role of fiscal agent on behalf of the government. So they're able to issue government securities, government bonds, and manage those on behalf of government. And this is very important. Institutional arrangements that need to be put in place. And I wish I had more time to elaborate on them, but basically, let me put those out there. So in Zambia, the law is very clear in terms of the constitution, who can contract debt, the role of parliament to approve debt, but there's a contradiction when it comes to now an act of parliament, the Loans and Guarantees Act, which does not reflect the spirit of the constitution. We need to harmonize these laws. And then we also have the Public Finance Management Act, which is a law that provides for budgetary laws and also debt management. So all these need to be reconciled with the constitutional provisions. Let me end there, Natasha.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kalinde. And I'll come back to you, I think, on the issue of the central bank and the importance of the central bank independence when it comes to debt management. But let me cross over to Fernando, and so that he can, keep talking to the issues that you've just raised. So Fernando, what are the minimum governance safeguards? We've heard about the case for Zambia. But what do you think are some of the minimum safeguards that should be assured by African governments to help achieve sustainable debt contracting?
I think just to follow up on what Dr. Kalinde has been saying, I think one of the, I don't know if I would call it a minimum standard, but one of the areas that needs to be examined in each state and each particular polity is that, are there these contradictions? Are there these areas where there is overlapping authority, where there's or where it's ill-defined, whether it's both the executive, the finance ministry, and the legislature that can or in parliament that can bind the state? Or are there even in Zambia's case where that's well defined in the constitution, when there can be a later statute which muddies the waters, which is perhaps not unconstitutional per se, but is against the spirit of the Constitution, is against that break. That exists in many states. And again, this is not only a problem in sub-Saharan Africa. It's not only a problem in the South. These problems exist in northern countries too, especially in countries where there is a federal structure, where there are different levels of government authority, where that can be difficult. So I think at a minimum, what policymakers and people in the legal profession should do is examine and call out these areas where there are contradictions, because again, that defeats this more global attempt at public debt management. Because even if there are these structures, even if there are these mechanisms for transparency, for accountability, if there's a set of laws or a set of statutes that make that more difficult, that needs to be addressed. And that's something that unless you're engaging the people that are doing this, you won't know about it. Because again, we all know our area of expertise. It's the very sophisticated economic analysis may run over the heads of many policymakers and lawyers, but these contradictions that are in the statutes, that's something that we recognize, and it's a more of an indication why we need to be doing this together and in conversation with one another.
Thank you, Fernando. Coming back to you, Dr. Kalinde, I think you started talking a little bit about, the importance of the independence of the central bank. So maybe you can just go ahead and explain to us what's the importance of having an independent central bank in ensuring that, we have sustainable debt contraction as well as management. And then on top of that, you can also tell us how can we ensure that central banks are kept independent in the region? So you'll have 5 minutes to respond to that.
Natasha, those are loaded questions, really, which I can't do justice to them in 5 minutes, but I'll try. And in terms of the importance of an independent central bank in ensuring sustainable debt contraction and management, I want to say from the onset that you'll find that in most emerging market economies, both governments and central banks are active in the sovereign bond markets. So you'll find that government is issuing debt of various maturities to finance its fiscal deficits, and the central banks also, they are also issuing their own securities to finance the acquisition of assets. In this regard, foreign exchange reserves, they are also issuing debt instruments to mop out liquidity in the system. So this now raises a problem where the two can conflict in terms of their mandate. A practical challenge is that the debt issuances by the central bank and the government might at times work at cross purposes. And you'll find that central banks are assigned the goal of macroeconomic stabilization, which is price stability. Well, the debt managers are typically mandated to keep the government's funding cost to a minimum. So there'll be a conflict sometimes in terms of their various mandates. And you'll see, especially this when you look at the maturity structure of government debt, which may actually impact on monetary policy. So because of these, conflicts, where the government maybe it would like to issue its debt in long-term paper, in order to reduce its cost, the central bank is looking for a short-term instrument to meet their day-to-day liquidity operations. So one way to resolve such potential conflicts is to align the objectives of the two decision makers. In particular, where debt managers will need to have a mandate that extends beyond standard debt management considerations, e.g. cost mitigation. And this now their mandate should include for them to ensure that there's an orderly functioning of the financial markets and overall microeconomic stability. In a similar vein, Natasha, central banks may need to factor in additional objectives to their debt issuance objective, as long as these do not compete with their core mandate, which is price stability. So moving on, Natasha, the good information flows between the central bank and debt managers can prevent many avoidable day-to-day stresses in the financial markets. Okay, so there is supposed to be this communication and coordination between the two. Now, the important point I need to raise is that it's important to realize that an independent central bank has got the benefits of delivering low and stable inflation, okay, to the country. And you see that when you look at the 1960s and 80s, which was the period, characterized by high inflation, consensus emerged that if you give the mandate to a central bank, which is a political independent and cannot easily be manipulated, you are guaranteed to have a central bank that is going to deliver to you low and stable inflation. So there's a trade-off between having an independent central bank and holding it accountable. Okay, so in order to reduce inflation biases and insulate monetary policy from short-term political pressure and time inconsistencies, it is essential, Natasha, that the independence of the central bank include a number of specific features. One, functional operational independence. This is whereby once the goal is given to the central bank by the government to say, look, we want you to achieve inflation of so much by the end of the year. We want you to accumulate reserves of so much by the end of the year. The central bank should be left alone now to design the instruments that they are going to use to achieve those goals. There should be no interference from the government in terms of how they will now operate to achieve those goals. So that's functional operational independence. Two, institutional autonomy. Institutional autonomy, Natasha, simply means that the central bank should not be subject of direction, okay, or orders being given by the government or anyone outside the central bank structure. The central bank should be able to make decisions without interference from outsiders. Then there's also the issue of personnel independence, which simply means that you want to give security of tenure to central bank staff, especially the governors, the deputy governors, and the board members. They should not be removed from their offices anyhow. They should have that security of tenure, knowing that if they carry out their duties in a professional manner, they won't be interfered with in terms of their employment or their continued stay in the central bank. And last but not the least, the issue of financial independence. A central bank should have its own budget, should have control over its own budget so that it can raise its own financial resources to conduct its operations. If a central bank is dependent on the government for subversion, then it's bound to be ineffective in its operation, in that the government can easily manipulate the budget allocation to the central bank to render it, ineffective. So the central bank should be able to raise its own funds, it should be able to control its own budget so that it can carry out its function. Okay. I hope I've made the 5 minutes mark.
You have, Doc, thank you very much. And very, very, I think very, very valid points. And like you said, I think the central bank should really just focus on monetary policy and making sure that inflation levels are kept to a minimum. So very valid. And obviously the need to coordinate to make sure that you have the same objectives either as the executive as well as the central bank. So I'll get back to Fernando now, because we've looked at the local structure in the country. We want the central bank to be independent. We want the laws to be good in terms of making sure that there's transparency, there's accountability for debt contraction. But what about globally? We know that obviously the global economy and the market is also important in form of rule setting and the role of global actors. What role do they have to play in terms of making sure that debt contraction by countries in sub-Saharan Africa is sustainable and is being well managed? So just explain and make recommendations for sound global governance as it relates to sub-Saharan Africa debt contraction and management.
Thank you. And I think one of the key points that that we, particularly those of us that are doing advocacy on this issue, and particularly for those of us that are from the North, is to remind both Northern policymakers, Americans and Europeans, and their societies that, Sub-Saharan Africa and the Global South did not create this crisis on their own. This is not a homegrown crisis. This is aided and abetted by policies, by a business culture, by financial policies, by the colonialism of the North, and that needs to be recognized. And making that recognition is also a admission that there is a role and there is a place for Northern governments to be involved with this, and that that can happen at the international level, where it's not just a question of us and them, that the haves and the have-nots, and that laws, regulations, structures at the national level in the United States, in European countries, as well as on the international level, at the WTO, at the IMF, at the World Bank, at the UN, that there are very that there are clear and defined measures that could be taken there. And again, this is an issue that we could discuss for hours on end. But one point in particular that I want to throw in is that there are particularly as it pertains to the private bond market, as it pertains to private creditors. The structures that exist in particular within US law, within, and to some extent European law, that favor those creditors when they bring suit in American courts, and the injustices that go with that inhibit sub-Saharan African states in making global resolutions of these matters. That it's all, even in the latest debt crisis, it's been that you have the public debt on one hand, and then you have this group of private bondholders on the other that have a very distinct set of of concerns. And northern states can take a much greater role in either resolving those issues or in changing their own sets of laws to make it more equitable for southern states. So there's a tremendous amount that can be done on an international and multinational level. So I think that's the takeaway, that there are areas that need to be examined on a national level, but there is work, a tremendous amount of work that can and should be done at the international level.
Okay. Thank you so much, Fernando. I have not seen a comment or a question in the text box. So I would like to encourage our participants to still go ahead and I think send any questions, contributions and comments, and we will be able to ask our very extinguished panelists to be able to respond. I think this has been a great discussion and a lot of important takeaways, I think, from the findings from the paper presented by Sabina. Very, very interesting. And, looking forward to, having that paper once it's published. And also a very, very, good contributions from our panelists. I'm seeing something in the text box before I invite, I think, Father Charlie or someone to talk. Okay, so I think there's a question. Just 1 minute. If poor governance is part of the reason we end up in debt crisis, is debt relief not rewarding instead of punishing that poor governance? Who wants to take up this question? Dr. Kalinda and then Fernando. If we give debt relief, are we not rewarding instead of punishing poor governance?
Thank you, Natasha. I would have loved for Sabina to go first, since she's the author of the paper. But really, the issue is that the democratic institutions in some of our countries in sub-Saharan Africa are so weak, such that you have leaders who are able to contract this huge debt and not properly account for them. So there is need to build institutions of accountability, institutions of transparency. So the question is now, are you going to subject the citizens of these countries to perpetual poverty because they were not able to hold their leaders to be accountable? They were not able to hold their leaders to be transparent in their debt contraction. So I think that there should be a holistic approach to this. And Sabina mentioned that in her presentation, to say that there were conditionalities attached to the HIPIC initiative. And these conditionalities included good governance, putting in place democratic institutions and all. So now when countries graduated under HIPIC, it appears there was a slack. There was a going back in terms of our democratic standards, in terms of our governance and all. So these things deteriorated. So civil society is very critical, to keep government accountable. The role that the Jesuits are doing, very critical. Parliament is critical. The judiciary, through the legal process of judicial review, can help to entrench these good governance standards and all. But Sabina should add more light to that question. It's a very important question.
Indeed. Before I invite Sabina to say something, Fernando, just under 1 minute. I think your comment and your last words, just under 1 minute.
The short answer to that question is yes. In a way, it does reward the poor behavior of people who contracted in an untransparent way and in a way that was selfish and in many ways corrupt. However, and Dr. Kalinde made this point, the fact of the matter is that at this moment, people are suffering. There is a crisis, and we would not be asking and pushing for relief if the need was not critical. And I think the last year and a half, COVID has revealed just how critical that need is. Because again, this all comes back to the fact that states in sub-Saharan Africa and states throughout the global South cannot raise enough revenue on their own to cover their fiscal deficits. They have to borrow. And what can be proposed, and I think what we're working at from this point forward, is showing ways that transparency, accountability, oversight can be built into new structures so that going forward, debt can be contracted in a much more responsible manner. Responsible is the wrong word. In a much more transparent manner, in a way that civil society participates in how, when, and why debt is contracted.
Thanks, Fernando. Sabina, do you have a response, a reaction, and in under 1 minute, your final words?
That is a very interesting question, and I like the take that the previous speakers have actually taken. So debt relief in itself, the intentions of debt relief are very noble. So as has been said, it looks at the situation as it is right now. So countries, citizens are suffering. So what then can we do with regards to elevating the current situation? But what needs to be talked about more often is debt relief in itself cannot work. It has got to be pegged on systems that are sustainable. And one of the critical things that we really need to delve deep into is the aspect of good governance. There was actually a paper that was done, and it was actually looking at the performance of these countries that were given debt relief past the debt relief initiative. And one of the things that was actually coming out is that for countries who went ahead and improved on their governance structures post receiving the debt relief, actually benefited economically with greater impact, as opposed to countries who just after getting the debt relief shifted and went back to their status quo. Another thing that actually came out that might try to explain why we have the rise and fall in debt level is when we looked at the governance indicators performance. For periods whereby debt relief was being issued out, one of the conditionalities of getting debt relief was with regards to a country has got to ensure that it has some levels of governance in place beforehand. There are other aspects in terms of how we rank it in terms of poverty levels and things like that. So some of these countries actually focused on improving some aspects of their governance, for instance, political stability and absence of violence, just so that they could benefit from the debt relief. Then after they got it, they shifted back to the whole aspect. So in a nutshell, debt relief, the aspect of it or the reason for granting it is very noble. But how countries therefore decide to navigate their way in order to get it or not get it, that in turn affects how economies then behave. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sabina, and very well done on your paper. Father Charlie, your reaction and final comments?
Oh, 1 minute comment. Yeah, just to mention, Dr. Kalinde and Fernando raised the importance of the legal structures and that they should be part of this conversation. I would like to reiterate that I think Sabina mentioned that that's actually the reason for this paper. In the literature review, we show that the discussion, the conversation between how the relationship between debt and growth has been there since the 1970s. But what has been missing is how this works. And that's why we put together also the literature now in the 90s that has suggested that for the debt growth relationship to be positive and good for countries, we need to bring into light the role of governance as well as good institutions. And that's why we brought this paper to bolster that. And that's why we bring in these legal related issues, the processes by which governments are selected, the capacity of governments to formulate and implement sound policies, respect of citizens and governments for their rules, so that we take this seriously and make them a condition to ensure that debt leads to growth.
To read and sign the Harare Declaration, go to www.afrodat.org/initiatives. Click on Afrodat Conference on Debt and Development, and then read more. And finally, the outcome statement.